And how's it going? My name's Arjun Byju, and I'm very honored and excited to be doing the April 2014 public forum debate topic analysis for Champion Briefs. Um, for those of you who don't know, like I said, I'm Arjun. I attended Pineview School in Sarasota, Florida. Shout out to PVPFD. And I'm a freshman at Harvard this year. I just this semester have been writing some topic analyses for Champion Briefs, and it's been a great honor. And I can really attest to the quality of the evidence and the quality of the analysis that you'll receive in these briefs. So, basically, I'm just going to do a brief topic analysis, kind of go over some of the things that I wrote in the briefs, and I'll try to be as concise as possible. I won't go too much into the arguments and evidence because I think you can find plenty of that in Champion Briefs in the argument section. I'd just like to outline some of the framework and some definitions and ways that I think it would be advantageous for one to frame the round. And hopefully you can find something helpful in there. All right, so without further ado, let's jump into it. The public forum debate resolution for this month is resolved. Prioritizing economic development over environmental protection is in the best interest of the people of India. So I think this is a really cool topic. There's, I think, two balanced sides, and I think plenty of literature to support both. So let's start with some of the terms. First, let's talk about prioritization. What does that mean? And this is a term that's come up in a few PFD resolutions recently, I think. And I think it's important to really frame it one way or the other, and that could be amenable to you depending on which side of the resolution you are. So I think the straightforward interpretation of prioritizing means to make something more important than something else. But then we kind of have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be more important? Does that mean that we spend more money on it, more time on it? You know what I mean? So, like, first of all, with economic development, does that mean that we spend more of our GDP and more national savings on developing the economy than on in protecting the environment? But then the question becomes, how much? Is it like a percentage? Do we have to spend 51% on developing the economy and only 49% on protecting the environment? And does that, is that the bright line, or does it need to be a more significant importance placed on one or the other? I mean, is it that we spend more time? Is it that we pass more pieces of legislation or laws promoting economic liberalization than India does promoting environmental sustainability? So it's kind of a tricky issue, and I don't think it's that clear cut one way or the other, but that's why I think you need to define it as a debater. On the opposite end of the spectrum, an alternative interpretation of prioritizing would be that it means dealing with like one thing first. I was judging some rounds before, and I thought this was like a really compelling argument that you might want to put one thing chronologically before the other. So, for example, we need to develop our economy before we can protect our environment, or protecting the environment is the prerequisite to developing the economy. I think one thing you have to be careful of with this is just because something happens before another thing, chronologically comes prior, does that really mean it's a priority? And an analogy I just kind of thought of is like, I have a friend, Sean, and he may be, he might have to take microfinance or microeconomics this semester, and that's his prerequisite, but his real major is economics or finance or business or whatever. So, just because it's his prerequisite doesn't mean that it's his real priority. His real priority is to get rich and make bank. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that just because something comes temporally first, but then for the rest of eternity, if the other thing's your priority, like how are you going to explain that to the judge? I think, in essence, it comes down to making sure that you have good warrants, and try to be a little bit more insightful than saying something like, well, my definition comes from Oxford English Dictionary, and his definition comes from Merriam-Webster, so mine's more legit. That's just very superficial, and I think if you warn it with some analogies and contextually, you'll be much better off. So then let's move on to the next term, which is also really important, and that's economic development. I think it's a little bit more straightforward and easier to define. Economic development refers to the processes and policies that increase human capital, economic health, education, healthcare, and more. That's according to Wikipedia. Also, I have all the links and citations for the evidence that I cite in the topic analysis in my brief, but if you need anything, just reach out to me or message me or email me or something, and I can give you the links to the citations. Okay, that being said, that's what economic development's outlined as. Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, who happens to be Indian, so he has extra credibility on this topic, makes an important distinction about economic growth, noting that factors like market productivity and GDP and GDP growth, they're only one aspect of overall economic development. Chuck Faree of the Cato Institute further explaining that just because your economy could be growing by traditional standards doesn't mean that it's developing holistically. You need to develop infrastructure. You need to develop healthcare, economic equality. You could say is it a component of or reducing economic inequality could be a component of economic development. So keep those things in mind. Interestingly, on Wikipedia, it cited the promotion of environmental sustainability within the scope of economic development. I couldn't find any citation for that specifically. I'm sure some sneaky kids out there will be able to find it. I don't know if that's something that will be a tenable position, but it might be interesting to say like, oh, well, promoting the economy is a priority because it includes promoting the environment. I think that'll probably end up being kind of abusive because the resolution probably is implying some implicit mutual exclusivity, but that raises another interesting question. Why are these two things incompatible? Why can you promote the economy at the same time as protecting the environment? I don't know. You have to do some research on that. And the previous LD resolution, which had to do with resource extraction and protecting the environment or something, specifically said when in competition or when in conflict. But the PFD guys kind of left that out. So I think it's implied, but maybe that's a place where you can be creative in the resolution. So the next thing that we can look at is environmental protection. What does it mean to protect the environment in India? I think we have an idea from an American point of view, but I think it's important also to understand from the Indian perspective. It was interesting, I read this thing from the World Bank, and it said that India has made some of the speediest progress in the whole world in terms of environmental protection, just in the last few decades. And another thing to note is that in India, air and water pollution seem to be the two largest economic concerns. So, not economic, I'm sorry, environmental concerns. So keep that in mind. How does India plan to address that? And to put things in perspective, how has it addressed that in the past? That's why I definitely recommend that you familiarize yourself with the Indian Environmental Protection Act of 1986. You can just Google that and find that online. You don't need to read the whole thing unless you have absolutely no life, but familiarize yourself with the bylaws and the eco standards, etc. And that will help you put things into perspective. All right, so the last term is defining the best interests of the people of India. I think this is crucial, and although it's self-evident, I think debaters need to link all of their impacts back to the interests of Indians. The trouble is, of course, who knows what their interests are? Do a bunch of 17-year-olds know what the interests of over 1 billion people are? Do even those 1 billion people know what their interests are? I'm not sure. But some ways you can answer that question. You can think about it in terms of majority. What's in the interest of the majority of the Indian population? What's in the interest of them objectively or subjectively? I think an interesting way to go with it would be to even look at generational disparities in interests. For example, within this current generation, it might be more important to them, or they ought to prioritize protecting or growing the economy. But for their grandkids and great-grandkids or several generations down the line, they're going to have a wrecked environment. And they might be thinking that it's in the priority of their generation that this current generation protects the environment. So I think that could be a unique way you could go with it, looking at long-term interests versus short-term interests. Maybe that would be a quick observation you can make. Or you can flip it the other way and say that we have to look to interests right now, because if we're planning for 100 years down the line but can't even do things in the status quo, then what's the point? So maybe another way you can do it is that ensuring higher wages for people through economic development is more important than reducing water pollution, or getting potable water is more important than getting higher wages. Those are all the things that you need to weigh. I think this is where it comes in crucially in the summary speech, is outlining why one thing is more important than the other. And I know good debaters know that that's important to do, but sometimes just forget and neglect to do it. So I highly encourage you to do that as well. So now that we've covered some of the key terms, I think we can know what the framework is going to look like and how debaters ought to, set up a lens for the round. On the pro side, let's just talk about a few pro arguments. I think on the pro side, there's just so many opportunities to talk about the benefits of economic growth and development in India. Several authors have contended that the rapid economic development that India has undergone in just the past few decades has dramatically reduced the amount of poverty and particularly dramatically cut the number of people in dire poverty. So Roma Jagadish and Pangaria outlined this research, I think, in a book called Why Growth Matters: How Economic Growth in India Reduce Poverty and Lessons for Other Developing Countries. It's a book, so if you like to read, check it out. Otherwise, you can just read a summary or something. But the idea is that economic liberalization has been and has the potential to be the catalyst for new levels of economic resurgence in India. And I think it's a very valid point. I think there could be rebuttals to it, in the NR, like in the neg rebuttal, you can say stuff like, well, this has only led to greater income disparity, or, it's made the people at the bottom worse off and the people at the top better off. But I think on the whole, it's kind of hard to argue with a lot of the hard facts that, less people are starving, less people are dying because of a lot of the economic development that's occurred. That being said, I think where you can go further with this is to argue that economic development ought to be prioritized because it's a necessary precursor to environmental protection. So the argument kind of goes like, if a country is not even capable or not even viable as an economy and can't even feed its people or shelter its people, then how can it even worry about protecting the environment? So a lot of this is codified in the environmental Kuznets curve. So I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I don't know if it's Kuznets or Kuznets. Look it up because you want to sound smart in round. I mean, it could be like French, le cousin, or Italian, or something. I don't know, that's stupid. This is kind of what it looks like here, for those of you. This is the Kuznets curve. And I think the main idea, just to know, and keep in mind this will be a very stock argument, but a very fundamental one. Think of this, the y-axis, as the impact on the environment, like how much we're destroying the environment, and the x-axis is kind of the level of economic development. So the idea is that as we develop, we tend to, or countries tend to pollute more, hurt the environment more, but they reach some sort of asymptotic level, and after some tipping point, I guess, it starts to go down. And the theory is that as you start to develop more beyond a certain point, once developing countries reach the point of developed countries, then their pollution and impact on the environment rapidly falls off. So it seems like a viable argument, and I think if you say, look, our growth in the economy is A, pulling millions of people out of poverty, and B, the first step to enable environmental protection, it's kind of like, a really strong reason why we should be developing the economy right now. That being said, I think there are several viable con arguments too. So I mean, it's difficult at first to agree with these concrete impacts of poverty reduction and saving life. So I think, although it can be done, I think the con should try to reframe the round, perhaps in terms of long-run benefits for Indians, and talk about how environmental protection benefits people in the long term, and that's why it's a better priority. A second option is just to show that all the economic benefits outlined by the pro come at the expense of certain demographics. If we're developing economy a lot and polluting and stuff, we're pulling some people out of poverty, but then there's a bunch of other people who don't have clean air to breathe or clean water to drink. So you have to do some research on that and see how it can be framed, because there's always trade-offs. There's inherent trade-offs with everything. Just in terms of the harms of pollution, I was kind of curious. I wanted to see if there were concrete impacts that one could draw. And I mean, just from my cursory Googling, I found there's like this Cornell study that says that pollution causes 40% of all worldwide deaths. I'm sure there's some flaws to that, and I know it's like worldwide, so not India specific, but it's along the right lines that pollution has concrete impacts to individuals in living in these countries, perhaps those at the lowest rung of the socioeconomic ladder, but it still hurts people. Lastly, I was kind of thinking, since this topic poses an inherent competition between economic advancement and environmental protection, it might be fun to research some DDEV theories. I'm speaking tinged with a little bit of personal bias, but de-development is kind of this there's plenty of literature, and it's this idea that advocates for slowing down, or pretty much like entirely reversing the economic progress of the world economy as a remedy to remedy the rampant destruction of the earth. It's kind of cool. There's plenty of authors who write about it. They're kind of wacko, like anarcho-primitivist guys, but there's definitely something to be said. You don't have to go all the way with it, but just something to be said for the fact that maybe we need to cut back on some of the economic growth because it just trades off so rapidly with biodiversity and environmental sustainability. So, I mean, it's a more esoteric idea. It's out there, but if you're feeling brave, you can do a little research on it. So that about covers the main arguments and the way to frame the round. I know I've gone a little bit long here, so sorry about that. But I think if you come in with an understanding of what you're trying to prioritize and what the best interests of the Indian people are, and always making sure you link back to that, and if you can, subsuming the best interests that your opponents talk about or that they make voting issues, you'll be well on your way to winning rounds. So if you're looking for more evidence, I strongly encourage you to check out the champion briefs. They've got great cards in there for this month. And for all of you competing at the TOC, good luck. Hopefully I'll see you there, and have a fun time debating. Thank you. Hope this was fun.